Downs, and with Kate Masur, we co-edit the Journal of the Civil War Era, which is pleased to host this discussion today. Depending upon your view of the seasons, this potentially concludes our summer season. Although if you have an academic vision of the season, you may well feel like summer has been concluded already. We've had a number of scholarly discussions during the summer and appreciate people's time, your questions, and your follow-up. And today we're going to be moving toward a discussion of how to turn our scholarship and our expertise to action. Before I go toward introducing today's speaker, I'll also let you know that we'll soon be announcing a schedule for the fall and winter and early spring, in part in response to a number of people who having come to these, have asked us to continue them through the fall, winter, spring, and we're reaching out to scholars, especially with new books on the way, and hopes that in the absence of scholarly conferences, that we can use this along with the many other fora that are available and becoming available to continue those scholarly discussions. And as many of you know, that's going on throughout this month, as ASALH in particular is hosting a series of conference events online throughout the week. And we encourage you to look for those, both those that speak to the mid-19th century, as well as to others in your field of interest. Today, Kate and I are delighted to host Scott Hancock. Scott's an associate professor of history and Africana Studies at Gettysburg College, where he has taught for almost 20 years. After receiving his BA from Bryan College, working in group homes with teenagers at risk, and then receiving his history PhD from the University of New Hampshire. His scholarly interests have focused on Black Northerners' engagement with the law, from small disputes to escaping via the Underground Railroad during the early Republican Civil War eras. He's more recently begun exploring how whiteness has been manifested on post-Civil War memorializations of battlefields. And his work has appeared in numerous places, including most recently back-to-back on Masur, the blog of the Journal of the Civil War Era, as well as on the Journal of Civil War History and Anthologies, City Lab, Medium, Huffington Post, and elsewhere. And we are delighted to welcome you today, Scott. All right, I will now turn over. Oh, go ahead.
No, just say thanks. Glad to be here.
Great. I'll now, Kate Masur, fellow editor of the Journal of the Civil War Era, will get us started. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks so much, and thanks to everyone who's in attendance. We're here to talk about the Civil War History Day of Action, which the Journal is sponsoring in a sense, and we're really inspired by a lot of Scott Hancock's writing and his work over time, and especially earlier this summer in presenting history at Gettysburg and then writing about what that experience was like. And so I just want to get started asking Scott, what do you see as the challenges that you're confronting when you go out and do demonstrations of good history in public sites? What are you trying to correct when you're doing that, and what are the issues that we face when we look at the commemorative landscape in terms of the history of the Civil War era, especially in the southern states, but really across the United States and elsewhere outside the United States as well?
Yeah, well, I think the main issue is scholars of those kinds of things know better than I, is that the commemorative structures and landscapes, there's always going to be something missing. And so I think our job as historians is to think about, well, what's missing from that? What's the messages that those monuments or memorials send because they're a form of discourse? And to fill that out, to fill that picture out, to fill the story out, especially in places like Civil War battle sites and other places where part of their design is to attract visitors and to educate people about history and hopefully connect that history to our present, to explain how we got to where we are. And so the challenges of doing that, of course, is sometimes some folks aren't excited about that fuller history. And so as we know from public discourse nowadays, we get accused often of wanting to erase history, which is part of the reason why we have the hashtag, we want more history, because I tell people, I'm not interested in erasing history. We want more history. We want to tell more of the story, and we want to tell it better. We want to ground it in evidence and communicate it clearly. So these are opportunities to do that.
So just to follow up a little bit on that, just for people who might not be familiar with what you did with a group of friends and family, tell us a little bit about kind of how you approached your demonstration of history that you did this year, or you can add in things you've done in the past, just to give people a flavor of kind of how you thought about this and how you went about it.
Okay, well, and this started, so a really brief history, this started in 2015 when after Tawanza Sanders and Clemente Pinckney and the other 7 people were assassinated in Charleston in 2015 in June. And as we might remember, a lot of Confederate flag memorabilia was pulled from stores, including a small percentage actually of the memorabilia at the National Park Service store at the Gettysburg National Military Park. And the response of some people, visitors and people who live in Gettysburg, was to kind of double down and have more displays of Confederate flag. And a neighbor of mine, who's a communications professor elsewhere, mentioned that right now this form of discourse is all one way because nobody's speaking back. And so that's when my family and I decided that we want to provide a fuller history and enter into that discourse. So when there are public displays of support for the Confederacy or celebrations of the Confederacy in ways that we would argue tell a really narrow version of that history, a version that for 150 years has helped maintain an ideology of white supremacy that's moved Black people out of the story or to the margins. So we want to, like I said, push back. We want to speak into that discourse. And so what happened on July 4th is something that we've been doing consistently, or as consistently as possible. And by the way, this call for action, I have to correct my wife, Patty. She's the one who came up with this idea, although I told her I would take as much credit as possible if it works. But the idea is to provide opportunities to engage in discourse with people, to provide, if they want to engage in conversation, debate, whatever, but also to be a public voice that moves African Americans, slavery, and everybody else back into the center of the story.
Thanks so much, Scott. And so just to pick up on a couple of threads before I'll ask a follow-up. Before I do that, just 2 notes for our viewers and listeners. Cecily Zander, who with Matt Isham are the people who make this go, has posted the link to the call to action, as well as the day of action sign up, which is the way that we'll continue to communicate with people who sign up and for those who wish to be connected with others. If you click that, then we'll be working on establishing possibilities of that connection, as well as the Twitter hashtag. So as a follow-up, let's first lay out on the table. It's implicit in a lot of what you said and probably obvious to many of our viewers and listeners. But those dual goals of capturing what was covered up, both the nature of the Confederacy that was covered up in the Lost Cause, and also the history of African Americans that was buried in part as a way of obscuring, of prettifying the nature of the Confederacy, but also making Black people disappear even from monuments to the Union and to opponents of the Confederacy. So a sort of more general disappearance. What is it? Where do you think that came from? Why is it that both of these are so pronounced in our public landscape, whether battlefields and elsewhere?
Well, and so my caveat is, as far as a scholarly research, this is a relatively new area for me over the last year and a half or so. But although you don't have to be a scholar of monuments to understand, I think, how much of this is work, that the two go hand in hand, that in order to justify a vision of the Republic as primarily one for white Americans, then understanding the Civil War as being fought over the right to own Black people, and to let Blackness enter into what was such a central part of American history, I think just ran against the grain in many ways, politically, legally, culturally, a host of other ways. So particularly in the South, but not just the South. And I think, like you said, Greg, this isn't just a Southern thing, right? This is something that happens all over the country over a period of about a half century, from the end of the war into the 19-teens or 20s, whenever one would want to roughly say that that history, that lost cause narrative that depicts the Confederacy as being just another version of America that was about freedom and independence and really didn't have anything to do with slavery, the early 20th century, when that's pretty much sealed. And so if it's a version of America that didn't have anything to do with slavery, African Americans are going to be at most peripheral to that discussion. They're not going to have a central causal role, because seeing Black people as driving the nation's formation, its identity, economically, whatever, would just be anathema to the ways in which history was starting to be told. And one of the other things, often, as you all know, we often get accused of being revisionist historians. So when I'm out in the battlefield talking to people and I hear that, I say, absolutely, we are revisionist historians. All history is revisionist. The history you're relying on is a bad revision. And so what we're trying to do is make good revisions that's based on evidence, where we know that African Americans and slavery, the institution of slavery, and the desire of the Confederate government, right, the Confederate leadership. So I try to avoid discussions about what motivated each individual soldier, because that gets really complicated. But the Confederacy as an organization, their organizing principle was to maintain slavery.
So why don't you give us, we'll talk some in a minute about some of your guidance for people who want to move into this work, but it might be helpful, as you've already alluded to talk about your own, a little bit more about your own path into it. When you've been seeking to make displays, we'll talk some more about the specific concrete forms those can take. What have been the messages that you've been seeking to convey, especially keeping in mind something that it's not only not an academic audience, which all of us are used to, but it also may well be an audience that's quite different from an introductory survey or a public talk where people have come with that expectation. So what are the ways concretely that you've tried to bring this message to that particular audience?
So when it's in a public event, like a Remembrance Day parade or something out in the battlefield, it's got to be simple, to the point, that you communicate a message that somebody, if they're driving by, they get it. And so initially, actually, my wife and my daughter-in-law made a sign for me that said at the top, slavery, 1863, and then 1962, segregation. Then it had a small images of the Confederate battle flag across the sign. And then below that, murder, 2015. And then again in 2017, when Heather Heyer was killed in Charlottesville. And the goal of that sign was admittedly to provoke people. I wasn't trying to get people angry, although I understood that some people would, but to get them to think about, okay, so the Confederate battle flag, which often is portrayed as, well, it was just the flag of soldiers. It represents honor, sacrifice, and bravery. My argument is not about whether soldiers individually were honorable or whether they were braved or sacrificed. Absolutely, that happened. I'm an Army kid. My father served 3 tours of Vietnam. I'm fully sympathetic to soldiers who sacrifice and serve whatever their idea of what their country was doing, right or wrong. But the battle flag, what it represented in 1863, ultimately was not just the soldiers, but a government and an institution that was about protecting slavery. In 1962, as we know, and in 56 and in 63, the Confederate battle flag, starting after World War II, gets resurrected as a symbol to resist federal mandates to dismantle Jim Crow. So it was about protecting white supremacy. And in 2015, at the Emanuel AME Church, and in 2017 in Charlottesville, again, the Confederate battle flag was a primary symbol that white nationalists and white supremacists grab onto. So what we did differently this July 4th, because actually I knew that there were going to be people out there with guns, so I wasn't looking to just Well, and I would say I wasn't looking in the past just to provoke people, and that sign has actually generated a lot of very interesting conversations with people and email exchanges afterwards. But this summer, what my friends and I aimed to do was, okay, well, let's just give people historical facts. Sometimes I've been accused, they say, well, that sign, that's your interpretation of the flag. I would say, okay, true. I would argue I can back that up with a lot of really good history and research. But so this time we thought, okay, I don't want to leave it up to any interpretation. So we just included quotes from people, Southern newspapers at the time, what they were saying about slavery. Different historical facts have been clearly verified by research about Robert E. Lee as a slave owner. And so the notion was let people engage with that. So they're not arguing with me, they're arguing with the history. They still argued with me, but so that was the goal of how we did things a little bit differently this summer.
Scott, thank you so much. So I want to kind of pivot now to talk a little bit about how we segued from finding out about what you were up to and the broader kind of questions that were being addressed at Gettysburg this summer to the larger call to action for September 26th, and then maybe get into some of the nuts and bolts of what we envision, and also then questions and discussions with the people who are here. So everybody who's in attendance right now, if you're looking at your video, you should see in the bottom to the right side of the Zoom window, there's a Q&A button. And if you want to ask a question, you would just press that button and write your question there. And we, the moderators, will see the question, and then we can kind of address the questions. We can bundle them together if there are similar questions being asked. And that way we can get a kind of a discussion going, because we definitely want to hear your questions and your input about this project. So, generally, well, first of all, I mean, there's a lot of ways into this, but Greg and I have been involved in the past in a lot of public history endeavors, including working very closely with the National Park Service on the interpretation of Reconstruction era. Hillary Green, the editor of Muster, is also heavily involved in with what we're doing, and she too has done a lot of public history and work particularly at University of Alabama in commemorating slavery on the campus. And elsewhere. And so the four of us got to talking about whether, what it would look like and whether it would be possible to kind of expand the type of thing that Scott and others had done at Gettysburg this summer. And in the context of these larger conversations that are going on about the public landscape of history, and kind of extend to a broader call to historians and their friends and co-conspirators and collaborators to do demonstrations of good history in public on a particular day. And to us, this has a number of different goals. It first of all puts good history out there in places where it's not really there, as Scott said, as places where the story is incomplete or dominated by a lost cause narrative, in places where African-American history has been made invisible. This is an opportunity to bring that history that so many of us teach in our classrooms out into public. Relatedly, it's a way of showing what historical knowledge can really do, right? That we have information, we have ways of knowing things and ways of doing research that are actually beneficial and can add to our collective American story and the collective fund of information that everyone can draw on, not just the students who come in and out of our classrooms or the people who read our books or articles. And we thought it would be nice to kind of bring people together this way and help maybe historians kind of come out into the world in this way at the end of a summer and a fall when we've felt so disconnected. And so, the goals are to just to be there, to kind of do this, to write about it, to think about what it accomplishes, to incorporate it back into our teaching, and then, leaving it up to people going forward to thinking about, what they would like to do with what they learn and experience through this activity going forward. So that's kind of the nutshell version of how I would describe this project. First of all, Scott, why don't you go ahead and just, add anything or kind of supplement with how you're seeing it?
Oh yeah, I think that's a good, like you said, a good nutshell. And some of it for me is encouraging us as historians to think about being scholar activists, as I've been encouraged by others. And we've got it's not like I'm doing anything that original, but but also to connect with people in the community. So my family has done this with me. The 5 friends who came to July 4th with me. That's a really important part of this for me, is that this isn't just an academic exercise. One caveat briefly. I remember Voldia Glimpf told me a few years ago, and she gave me permission to share this story, so I've shared it probably more often than she anticipated. That when she grew up in South Carolina as a kid, they weren't marching about monuments. They were marching about things like the right to vote, the right to go to a decent school. So I always keep in mind that this is just one small part of a much larger struggle for equity and justice in this country and elsewhere. But it is nonetheless an important one, because as we know, this lost cause narrative has had very tangible effects on Black people and white people and Native Americans and a host of others, right? This isn't just an academic exercise. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's really important to connect this with people in the community. This is not just about historians wanting to write an article or publish a book. This is about a lived experience and how we can make this a part of making society better and more equitable. And I know that sounds idealistic, but we should be idealistic, right? So.
Absolutely. Now, in helping historians turn from thought, intention to action, you described, both this sort of long-term understanding of history as activism, which I think many, though not all people in the profession share, but also this kind of series of engagements in and around Gettysburg that helped you kind of come to the place that you are now of what's possible. For people who don't have that, let's try and if we can, kind of lay out some of the nuts and bolts of what they, have had to get them up to speed. And they don't have 5 years, but 3 weeks or so to prepare. If you were advising someone, we've gotten several questions from people in the DC area or so on. We'll take some other kind of questions that come up. But if you were advising someone in the DC greater area who saw this, thought this is right, this attaches, my beliefs about the past, my beliefs about the present, help me figure out what to do. What are the steps you think someone should take as they think about how they might participate? How might they select a site? How might they think about the message they want to convey as two starting places?
Okay, so choosing a site, that's a good question. So, and part of what we focus on is Confederate memorials. And you could certainly expand this, like you mentioned before earlier, Greg, Union memorials that don't tell us the complete story. But I would go about choosing a site by thinking about, some physical manifestation, right? Because it's there because it attracts attention. And what's the story that monument, statue, whatever maybe, what's the story it tells, and then what's missing from that story. And often, so not always, but often there's documentation that's not always that hard to find. Sometimes it is, but national park sites, they often have their own libraries that will have documentation about the process that led to that monument being there, and those are publicly available. The Gettysburg National Military Park, for instance, their library, anybody can access it. Generally have to make an appointment ahead of time. So what you said, Greg, it's 3 weeks, but I would, so the sooner the better if you want to do some of that research. A lot of stuff is available online, digitally, although of course, make sure your sources are legit and that it's sound. But I think it's about trying to figure out what story that monument tells and what stories it doesn't tell. Well, I don't want to go on too long. We can get more specific if people ask questions. And I'm sorry, what was the other part of your question? I'm not sure I answered that one that well. So you can push me for more detail as you want.
No, I think mostly getting started on those questions of how to decide where and how to decide what, right? If we started, if you and I started outlining all the things that are wrong about the popular understanding of history, right, it would fill volumes, right? So how do we think about when we want to be strategic about what to focus on as a lever into public memory? You know, what's your guidance on that? What are the arguments or the disputes that really matter at this point?
Okay, yeah. So when it comes to Confederate monuments and memorials, I think it's about recognizing it's in terms of specific questions. So for instance, one could argue that a monument to a specific soldier, like I said earlier, well, you know, I'm not trying to get into the particular motives of a specific soldier, but even monuments to a soldier, a colonel or a general, whatever, they represent something larger. And that something larger we know from when they were put. So that would be the first thing, is find out when the statue was erected, if you can. And often it's just right there on the base of the statue is when it was erected. So they're erected in a particular era, particular purpose, and those statues are not telling the stories generally of African Americans and slavery. So any kind of identification of a Confederate memorial, I think you can connect that, whether it's on National Park Service or not, that is erected during a time period when during Jim Crow and white supremacy is being reinforced in a variety of ways, including really violent racial terrorism. So, and I think I'm getting off track a bit, sorry, but one of the practical things actually is often just thinking about the physical area around it. So, you know, if you're going to pick a statue that's in the middle of a rotary where there's no space to stand and you're probably going to be in violation of traffic laws, I would either find someplace else, or you have to think about where you're going to be on the sidewalk. And then you get into particular issues about whether the police can tell you're blocking traffic. And legally, they have the ability to tell you that you cannot be there if you pose any kind of traffic hazard. You know, so can you find areas like public parks where that's not an issue? So I mean, that's some of the nuts and bolts, but yeah, I'm sorry, Gregory. I feel like I'm not really answering your question well.
Scott, I think I mean, it's great, and you're combining thinking about the historical story of a particular monument with thinking about the concrete details about where it's located and what that implications of that would be for you if you were deciding to spend a couple hours there on a Saturday, right, in September. Yeah. I would just want to add that I would think of also, if you're thinking about, well, how could I do this? I would also think about sites of absence where there may not be a memorial and you think there should be one. So, I mean, I know that when Greg and I were researching the history of Reconstruction for the National Park Service, one of the primary issues was that absence of commemoration, that the idea that basically, you know, just about anywhere you go in the South, fascinating, important, interesting things happened in the course of ending slavery and the era of Reconstruction that are not commemorated. The places where African-American men cast their first votes, the places where Black elected officials lived, the places where African-American churches convened, even if those churches are no longer standing. And so I think that this project opens the possibility also for going to places that aren't necessarily marked and holding up a sign and having a discussion about what could be there that we're not seeing. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. And also I posted in the chat a link to an article by Ann Twitty, a professor at Mississippi, about her experience finding an article describing the dedication of the statue on their campus in the database newspapers.com. So there are all kinds of resources at our disposal for researching the history of particular monuments, or even the history itself of what happened, for example, the day the Emancipation Proclamation was read in a given spot. That stuff is more accessible than ever before because of digitized newspapers and other kinds of primary sources. So I think all of us envision kind of doing a bit of background research in order to learn about the site and have information to present to folks.
And maybe this gets at your question better, Greg, because one basic question I think you can ask of any site with a Confederate memorial or a Union, or like Kate is saying, that where there's an absence, is does this site answer the question, why was there a war? You know, why? So if there's a particular battle site like Gettysburg, I think, so does the landscape here, the memorials, tell people, if you came and you didn't know anything about the Civil War, does this monument tell you why there was a war? And most of them don't. You know, you would never get that from memorials, whether Union or Confederate for that matter. So you can start thinking about how would you tell people who were interested in history at all, how would you tell them why there was a war? The whole reason why there's a statue there in the first place, because we had a civil war about slavery. And so even if you can't find specific details about that statue or that site, you can at least figure out ways creatively with signs or whatever to provoke people to think about that question.
That's great. And then additionally, in terms of absences, about what historically happened at this site that has been covered up or obscured. I mean, one of the things that, I know that many of us utilize when we teach are the, things like the roadside marker to the Stono Rebellion, which, as you probably know, I mean, you risk your life to pull over to try and read it. It took enormous work of the community to get anything to the Stono Rebellion, and it's extremely difficult to access in a way that you could read it. And I set up to my classes and I say, but that's okay. We all know South Carolina would never put up monuments to rebels and then flip to the State House. And they, even first year college students sort of laugh at the juxtaposition. Because it captures their, people I think are often attuned to the history that's been done badly, but blind to the history that's not there at all. But that's part of the impact of what we don't commemorate is that it's easy to forget even something as monumental as the Stono Rebellion. It's a long way of feeding into the question that we got from our co-conspirator, from our collaborator, Hillary, who's the fourth person, who's Green, who's the fourth person who's helped to organize this and who's done all kinds of path-breaking work herself on public memory and the memory and lives of enslaved people, especially on college campuses and elsewhere. But what are the things that, she asked, what are the things that people who don't live near a battlefield can do? If somebody thinks that's right, and it's the cover up and it's also the absences that matter, but they don't live near a big national park site, what are the ways that they can be part of this action?
Well, yeah, we know there are many memorials and statues in places that are not battlefield sites. So I think it's about asking the same kinds of questions about why is this statue here? Why is there a war? Why are they, why are certain things commemorated and other things not, like the presence, the fact that the Confederates used slaves in a variety of ways at battlefields and other places, that African Americans were central to the economy of the South, that statues went up in locales without any consideration of the opinions or perspectives of Black populations in most of those towns. But even I had a student who lives in Vermont, and so they're asking these kind of questions. Well, what do you do in Vermont? There's no battlefield there. There aren't Confederate memorials or presence there. And if you can't get to a southern site, granted it's more challenging, but you can ask these same kind of questions about, so how is the Union narrative told? And Vermont has many, many, many monuments to Union soldiers. I don't know how many of them address this fundamental question about why was there a war. And granted, not all those Union soldiers are fighting. A lot of them could have cared less about Black people or slavery, but many of them did. But it's also asking that same fundamental question, I think, about why was there a war, and what does the commemoration of these soldiers in the decades afterwards mean in a particular community.
And if one aspect of that is not only the war, but also the portrayal of the war, but also the disappearance or the amnesia about the experience of both slavery as an institution and African Americans as historical actors. In what ways can people, we've gotten questions from people in Canada, we even have an answer from someone in Scotland. So, I'm glad to say we're getting not only questions, but answers. California, from places that are farther afield of the Civil War, even than Vermont. What are the ways, if they want to, and if they don't live near a place where there's a strong commemoration of the Civil War on either side, but where there is a public memorialization that doesn't say much about African Americans, for example, or slavery, what are the ways that they can be a part of this? In other words, what are the ways that they could, even in Scotland or in Calgary, or in California, someone could say, there's a place for me here too. It might be different than the place at Gettysburg or at Vicksburg or Raleigh or something, but there's a place.
Yeah. Well, so in terms of if they want to like go out and make a public demonstration, that's one question. I'll have to think about that a bit. But in the digital age, there's a lot you can do, because the reality is, so folks who are interested in doing this at different public sites in their towns or battlefields or wherever, it takes work. It takes a lot of time to do the research. So for instance, some of the quotes that we put in signs and stuff, this is several hours of work on my part. I'm not trying to make it sound like, oh, this is such a hardship or anything, but I would welcome the contributions of people if they want to do digital research and connect with people who are on the Google Doc form that you have on Masur, that they can sign up and connect with people and offer their skills. And particularly if you're a historian, if you've been trained as a historian, then that would be an invaluable contribution to have people helping with work on connecting with people in that Google Doc and helping do work at a particular site. So that's one way that comes immediately to mind for me. You don't have to be someone who's going out holding a sign next to a monument to contribute in really important ways.
Thanks so much, Scott. I wanted to mention or talk about some information that Pete Carmichael from Gettysburg College, who you, Scott, have worked with quite a bit on these issues, and Pete has been tremendously helpful and supportive in giving us input on this project. And he's typed a few things into the Q&A that I just want to make people aware of because they're so helpful. One has to do with just engaging, thinking about so a lot of people have questions about how to engage with people that they may encounter. And I want to turn it back to Scott in a few minutes to talk specifically about that. But so I think, we, in this climate, you'd sort of never know, in any climate really, who you will encounter on any given Saturday at your site. You may encounter people who are curious about what you're doing, who want to talk to you, who don't want to talk to you, who walk right past you, who don't like what you're doing. But one of Pete's main points is to kind of emphasize that when you engage with people, when you're standing there with a sign and it's historical information that you want to convey, that it's important to try to, when people engage with you, to talk with them and maybe meet them a little bit where they are, ask what they, or learn what they are coming to that site expecting, what they think about that site already, and then you can kind of engage in conversation about what it is that you're trying to do. And Scott, I know you have some more thoughts on that, which I want to share, but Pete had a specific thing that he said, feel free to share this. He plans to go to Petersburg and bring letters from Confederate soldiers describing the massacre of the US colored soldiers there at the crater. So these are, again, letters written by Confederate soldiers. I mean, not the literal letters, but excerpts from the letters. Sorry, that just disappeared from my screen. Oh, Matt, I think. So let me just fill in the blank because I don't see it anymore. I think it just got marked answered, so it went away. But to show what people at the time thought that they were doing, and to show kind of the reality, as Scott was saying before, that we can know things about the past, that challenge our received wisdom about what happened in particular events. So sorry, that just disappeared. But Pete adds, letters will open up the discussion. And it really gives you, as we all probably, many of us who teach in classrooms have experienced, when you go to a source and you have a source that you're discussing with other people, that gives you a grounding, right? It gives you a thing to talk about that you share in common. This is a source from history. This is what I think of it. Have you ever seen a source like this before? And that sort of thing. Scott, over to you for kind of some concrete discussion of what it's been like to talk with people, both folks who are interested in what you have to say and those who are quite skeptical.
Yeah, well, and so Pete's example is a great one, and another way in which I think if you're a historian, or even if you're a student, you got access to those kind of historical databases that can help people at other sites with that kind of information. It's a huge help. It's one of those really practical things that it takes a lot of time to prepare for this well. So people helping to do that And to whoever's asking from Scotland, the connections to slavery and the slave trade, as we know in Scotland and England, are huge. So there's plenty of ways you could enter that discussion from there as well, thinking about the effects of slave compensation, the Slave Compensation Act in the 1830s in Britain, and a host of other things. But as far as engaging people, like Pete said, so having those kind of concrete points of discussion that you can point to start a conversation, hopefully. And frankly, I find often it's about asking people questions. And I was reading an article, I can't remember who wrote it in the last couple of weeks, talking about the reality is when people are emotional and responding emotionally, and I don't mean this like they're being unreasonable or threatening, but just any kind of emotional argument, if we respond with facts, that might help, but you're probably not actually trying to see things from their point of view. And I think we need to approach people with what I call an analytical empathy. So it's empathy, kind of understands and thinking about, so why are they approaching this from this point of view? Why are they having this reaction? And as best we can, trying to, with some kind of analytical point of view, understand why they're having that emotional reaction. And so it's not just about proving them wrong, but it's more, I think, about asking them questions, trying to invite them into a conversation. And sometimes it's simple things like I tell people my name and I ask them their name. Sometimes they won't tell me their name, but usually they do. And trying to make this a conversation between two people instead of a conversation about two issues. And often that's not going to work. One of the things that I find many folks do is they play a game that I call move the target. So they ask you a question, and I think we try to answer their question, and then if we can, ask them a question in return, not an aggressive question. But often when you answer their question, they'll, and I'm sure we've all had this experience, the response is, well, what about this? And what about this? And so it's constantly moving the target, so you never actually deal with any single issue. And one of the things I would suggest, as much as possible, is politely, respectfully trying to turn people back to the history. So for instance, conversations about Robert E. Lee as a slave owner. And technically, so his wife owned 189 slaves, but as we know, if you're a white and you're a woman in the South and you're married, it's your husband who is the de facto one who controls and owns that property. So Lee is a slave owner. People will ask questions. They'll say, well, black people own slaves too. Yes, some free black people did own slaves. Well, let's talk about Robert E. Lee, since he's the one that's on the monument. So I think it's about constantly turning people back to whatever the focal point is. And sometimes people will engage with that, and sometimes they'll refuse. When they refuse, I think after a point, you got to just let the conversation move on to wherever they want to take it.
So I want to thank you so much. And you brought us to a word that sometimes makes historians antsy after all the theory that we read in the 90s at Zeros, which is facts, or another way of getting at that historians use is the word evidence. But of things that help people to confront the words and deeds of the people, of the historical actors themselves, in a way that gets beyond, it doesn't get beyond our interpretations, but it can help open that window. And I want to point out before asking the next question that there's a number of really generous offers in our Q&A section, and I'll repeat them here, for people who have not. Who haven't looked there. First, Pete Carmichael at Gettysburg followed up by offering very generously that the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College, a place that all of us have visited and spoke at, and a great center of learning on these issues, that he'll be happy to track down or suggest primary sources for any site connected to a Confederate monument, and inviting people to email him in order to connect up with people who can help with the CWI. And his email is on the Q&A, and that's extremely generous. As well, Hillary Green, our collaborator, co-conspirator, has written about signs that there were some questions about Elizabeth City, North Carolina, an area she's very familiar with, and where there's some really interesting sounding work that's taking place that Charles Reed wrote about at Elizabeth City State and HBCU there, of classes that are looking to find specific and concrete examples of AFM history in the area. And Hillary wrote that she has signs that she's willing to share for people interested in the Elizabeth City, North Carolina area about African American USCT veterans, 1898 GAR reunion, and emancipation celebrations that she's been able to build at Canva, a free site for making high quality signage. So there's a lot of exciting offers in there, as well as an offer from a NPS employee, reminding people that park interpreters, while they certainly don't take, we're operating on our own, as we'll talk about, and of course they don't take stands on political or issues in front of Congress, but that interpretation is their job. And in fact, all of us have had experience with incredibly inspiring park interpreters, many of whom have quite a lot of knowledge and interest in the landscapes that they came to interpret. And so, we need to acknowledge, both celebrate, that they may well be interesting resources, and also acknowledge that there has been significant efforts by NPS to try and improve a landscape that was set in place, decades or, even a century before many of them arrived. And that many of them, for especially the last 25 or 30 years, have been working diligently to try to improve. So there's a lot of exciting things going on out there, including in our Q&A section. Let's talk about things that could, along with that excitement, that could go wrong. So, we've had questions about social distancing and how to preserve that, and also about confrontation. You've talked a little bit about dealing with confrontation by introducing yourself, by, staying on facts. But if you'd be, we've got some other questions on this front too, but if you'd be willing to start with those two things. What's our goals for people in terms of maintaining respect for our, pandemic and people's health? And what are the ways that we can help people to think about how to de-escalate any potential conflict?
Okay, yeah, so in terms of the pandemic, so we tried to do that on the 4th, and this is definitely a new variable, a new wrinkle. So I certainly don't have all the answers to that, but we had masks, either on us or around our neck. So when you're talking a lot, especially because it was hot here, it's difficult. And if you're someone like me who sweats a lot, that mask gets soaked through in a hurry, and then it's practically useless anyway. But at least having it, for me, demonstrates that because we are scholars or other community members who value evidence and the science behind COVID there's lots of evidence, how easily transmitted it is. So we want to respect that. So we want to demonstrate that we are in agreement supporting what the scientific community, what our brothers and sisters in the science world are telling us. And frankly, even the folks who have disagreed with me over the years, even before the pandemic, I've very rarely had people physically get in my face. And people generally maintain that kind of distance anyway. So I think it's just important among your group that you all understand you're going to demonstrate that as you're standing at whatever site or walking around whatever site that it is. In terms of de-escalation, one of the things that we had agreed upon on July 4th, and I've told other people, so when you've got your signs, whatever they may be, no matter how much time you spent making it, if somebody's going to try and take it from you, let them. That's what I would do. I mean, people make their own decisions, but I just don't think it's worth it escalating into a physical, potentially violent confrontation over a sign. So if they want to take my sign, I'm going to let them. However, I also came to July 4th with about 15 signs. so that if they took one and tore it up, then after they left, I would have just gone in my car and gotten another one. So I probably wouldn't have done it while they were there, because then it seems like you're just provoking them, and they're probably going to do it again. And in terms of verbally, again, I think once you get into shouting matches, it's just not productive. I think it's about keeping in mind the purpose, right? The purpose is not us. The purpose is telling a more complete story, a better history, because we believe that this actually impacts people's lives in the long term in very tangible ways. So it's not about having an answer to every question, because sooner or later somebody's going to probably ask you something. Maybe you know it, but you just can't remember it at the moment. Whatever it is, that's okay. I would also recommend that you avoid making this political. And again, so we, Kate and Greg and Hillary and I are not trying to dictate to people at all. This is what you have to do. Just my suggestion. I'm not planning on going and wearing any shirts with political message like Biden or Trump or whatever it may be, because that's not what it's about. It's not, you'll probably get accused of that you're trying to be political, or you're trying to, it's because it's an election season, whatever. But those kind of really overt political, in terms of political campaign, Democrat, Republican. I mean, if people want our Black Lives Matter shirt, I mean, I know that's political, but I think, well, but that's a statement of truth. Black Lives Matter. So that's up to you. But I think there are certain things you can think about. Are these unnecessarily provocative? So if you're a big Biden supporter and you're going to go wearing a Biden shirt, then I would argue that's going to become the focal point instead of what you're trying to do there. So.
Thanks so much. So I want to just get to a couple of other questions that are here. We try to keep these to about an hour, and there are a bunch of kind of logistical issues. I mean, one person asked about publicity, and yeah, so we have, so Muster is kind of the clearinghouse for our publicity around this. We're hoping to run some more pieces on Muster between now and the 26th, which just kind of we don't have a firm plan. If you're interested in writing something, feel free to write to us. Just send us an email if you're interested in writing a September 26th piece for Muster. We'll keep on, and we want, actually, this was a great idea that Hillary brought forward. I mean, we encourage everyone to write about what you're doing for whatever venue, even if it's for your own personal history or to inform your teaching later. But we hope that there will be, we'll be producing writing about this that can potentially be on Muster. We don't have a plan to run it in the print issue of the journal, but that could happen depending on kind of how this comes together. We're happy for people to publicize what we're doing. We're trying to be 100% transparent about what we're doing. And so, if you're interested, some people have already been contacted by local media in their area. If people are working with media, that's fine for coverage on the day of. So, it's kind of, and that gets to a different point that I wanted to make sure that we mention. So, we envision this as a very decentralized thing. We're providing the kind of date, the impetus, some advice, and we want people to select a site and do this in the way that they feel good about. But that said, there's some areas where people who know each other are already banding together and deciding on what to do. And then there are also areas where a number of people live who have gotten in touch with us through the Google Doc who don't necessarily know about one another's existence. So part of our job, that is Greg and Scott and Hillary and I, in the next week or so, is to get in touch with you. Those of you who live in areas where there are clusters of people, we will reach out to you. If you've given us permission using the Google Doc, we'll reach out to you and tell you who else has signed on or is interested in your area. So that's part of our job, is to connect people in particular areas with one another. Then they can choose, you can then choose kind of how much you want to coordinate, or if there are multiple sites in your area, thinking about, for instance, the DC area where there are lots of people and also lots of sites, you can decide how to distribute yourselves or what you want to do. And so part of our job in the next week, again, is to connect people. But the only way that we will know about you is if you sign up using the Google Doc. So there's a link, there are links to it in a lot of places, but this is a basic document that you can fill out with your name and email address and your location. And that way you'll get our emails, you'll get updates from us, and we'll have the ability to connect you with other people in your area if you're interested in doing that. So I did want to mention one thing, and that is we were notified earlier today that the National Park Service special events coordinator in Washington wants us to know that they think that what we're doing comes under the category of demonstrations, and that therefore what we're planning here, if you're going to a national park site, this does not apply to outside the National Park Service, but that if you are going to go to a National Park Service site, that you would need an advance permit. So what we're going to do for everybody who signs up with us through the Google Doc, we're going to share that letter with you so you can see what they're communicating to us, and we can provide, we don't actually have additional information beyond the letter at this point about that, but we're happy to provide it to you in the interest of full transparency, and then going forward, we'll all have to make decisions about what that means for deciding to do this at a Park Service site, and in what form or capacity.
And go ahead. And so a couple of questions that have kept coming in that I think take us back to something that we've touched on, but is worth emphasizing to absence. So, someone mentioned, what do they do if they know or believe they know of a, say, Freedmen's Bureau site or a former school, but that right now might be nothing, or maybe it's been, obliterated and is replaced by, a strip mall or something. As I mentioned, that this also shaped the question that came from Charles Reed at Elizabeth City State, where they're finding all kinds of things with the students, with an undergraduate class, about a landscape of African American history in the area that has, that doesn't have a marker. Right. What do you think are interesting ways and effective ways of conveying information about what should be there, in a way, that's it's a different challenge than standing in front of what exists and saying, this is what this monument obscures, to stand in front of an empty site or a retail establishment or something and say, do you know what happened here? So how would you suggest, in Gettysburg, you're surrounded by lots of things that were built up and commemorated around you, but also by silences. Mm-hmm. How do you think people might approach those kind of challenges or opportunities?
Well, that's one of those things, right? If you know some creative people in your community that you can connect with, especially when it comes to art. I have no artistic talent, so would not pretend to be able to suggest things, but one of the former high school students that I used to coach in soccer is now an architect, and he has made some really brilliant suggestions about ways some of those silences could be commemorated on the Gettysburg battlefield, about the presence of the 6,000 to 10,000 slaves, for instance, around the battlefield. But what I would love to do is get somebody who had some artistic vision to make signs or images or things like that to take to sites like what Charles Reed said at Elizabeth City, to help people imagine, well, this is what it could be, and be asking the questions, why isn't this here? The funds and resources that have been devoted over the years to put up monuments or tell stories or create parks were not devoted toward telling these kinds of stories of Black people in these sites. Why not? And what could it be? As we know, Asheville has this this movement toward reparations, thinking about how they're going to redirect some funds for infrastructure. These are the ways that local communities perhaps could start advocating for that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think that's great, and just brings to mind when I visited the South Carolina Sea Islands and the site of Harriet Tubman's raid, that was, you know, known among a lot of people, among people who knew about Harriet Tubman. And this was, you know, I think 1864, raid up the Combahee River. And there were some local people who really wanted to see more local commemoration of Harriet Tubman and her role in that campaign. And so they started talking about what she had done there. So basically her presence was not there on the landscape. And eventually, a number of plaques were put up due to the activism of local people, and a bridge was named after her. And so, you know, the absence doesn't need to stop people from talking about what actually happened there. And it was a powerful to see that by the time, you know, 2014 or whatever, that these efforts had yielded real changes in the landscape, in how people move through the landscape and would see notices about Harriet Tubman and what she had done there. So I think it can be a really interesting beginning to do that research and, you know, and just stand there with a demonstration of that history in public.
Yeah,
Scott,
yeah.
Go ahead, Terry.
Well, that's part of the goal, right? And I want to make sure that we are clear that we are, part of this is wanting to come alongside National Park Service, other entities. There are some places where nobody's been doing any of this. There are some places where people have been. And so it's not about, we want to recognize the place where people have been doing that, and it's coming alongside. And also that, you know, we recognize that a plaque can't compete with a 41-foot statue, but it's an important first step. And that ultimately, you know, this is what perhaps can lead to those kind of monuments, memorials, because the reality is monuments, memorials will never tell the whole story, but they attract people. And they give you opportunities to tell a fuller story or to obscure the story.
And one of the things that struck me in the site, I was there at the same place at the same time when Kate was that it seemed to me, I didn't quiz people, but that it attracted people, that there were people with a range of positions, say on political issues, who were all moved at the idea that a place that they knew was a place to go fishing or to put in their, you know, little boat, was a place that had a real important meaning in history. And I think that speaks to the idea that we may not be able to utilize this to change people's entire worldviews or political views, but we might be able to, if we establish a sort of little wedge that opens up to say, there's actually a lot more going on than I thought, right? Yeah. And that in that sense that you could see people who may not have, you know, may have approached Harriet Tubman's role there from quite different positions, but can seem to come together at a sense that this was really an amazing thing that took place right around them, and people should know about it.
And by the way, I want to encourage people, this stuff can make a difference. You know, so one of the things they're doing at Gettysburg National Military Park is they're putting in signs about why the Confederate state monuments went up and when they went up. That also address, because I think like what you're saying, Greg, is really important, but I think it's also important that we encourage towns and state parks and national parks to address the fact that often these places have been complicit in hiding these stories and maintaining white supremacy. And so seeing this happen at Gettysburg National, the first steps is cool. And by the way, I want to make sure this is not because this is what Scott Hancock has done. There have been many other people, Pete Carmichael, his students, as well as others, Chris Gwynn and other people at Park Service. They've been doing this stuff for years. So that's, I think, how we see ourselves. And we just want to come alongside and help keep, you know, pushing the train up the hill in that direction. So.
That's great. Before we move to wrap, I wanted to give you a chance. You type something in the chat, and some people are seeing all the chat, and some people are focused on our riveting visages, so might not be. So I wanted to give you a chance. You put in a few other practical measures, and I just wanted to give you a chance to say those aloud and make sure that people hear those, because they're very important, especially for people who don't have your own long experience of doing these things.
Yeah, so I think just some real practical things, some things I didn't mention, like if you're going to National Park Service, if you have a sign, make it a flexible sign. Shouldn't have a pole that's more than, I would say don't have a pole or post at all. But something that if you do, it can't be longer than 3 feet, because you don't want anything that can turn into a weapon. And all this talk, by the way, about potential dangers, we should be aware of it. I don't think this is going to be anything like what happened here on July 4th in Gettysburg, because the reason people came with guns was for a very different reason. And I don't think I'd be surprised if this happens. And as I've said before, this isn't, the primary goal isn't about removing memorials and statues. I mean, if people want to advocate for that at their site, feel free, but that's not our primary goal. It's about telling a more complete story. So this isn't about threatening monuments, defacing monuments, none of that kind of stuff. But some of the other practical things I mentioned is don't go alone. I say go with friends. Some of that's a safety issue, but some of it's just you'll feel safer if you're not by yourself, in case there are people who want to argue with you, who seem to get upset. But some of it's really practical, because if you're not alone, you can have people who are recording it, right? If you're holding a sign, have somebody else who's recording it so they can post on Instagram or whatever, so you can record it for yourself, your friends, but also the historical academic community. I think we would love to see these things, because this is a part of history. And also, frankly, if you have people recording, I think it helps deter anybody who might want to get a little bit too confrontational. People know they're being recorded. I think they tend to tap it down a little bit. I also mentioned having multiple people there, not everybody holding a sign. You can do practical things, like somebody can bring an umbrella in case it's rainy or too sunny, and you can have somebody standing over with you. Some of that just really kind of easy stuff. The site that Hillary posted for making a sign I had not seen before, want to check it out. I think, yeah, the clearer and simpler you can make signs, the better. One of the things that I mentioned, I think to you all, is cite your sources. So like in some of the signs we had the quote, and then in small letters at the bottom, it said like, I think the Charleston Mercury or whatever was 1862. We had the newspaper we got it from, or the letter or whatever, because people will say things like, well, how do we know that's legit? You can say, well, this is the source. You can probably go look it up online yourself nowadays. The Confederate Constitution has some nice little tidbits in there about protecting Negro slavery. So even if you don't have something specific to your site, you can cite things like that. Now, there's all kinds of ways you can do that. I don't think signs have to be professional. My wife is really good at making signs, but even if I didn't have her talents, I'd scribble it out on a whiteboard. You can get them from Walmart. They're like 79 cents for a 28 inch by 22 inch sign, or a Dollar General or wherever. In many ways, simple is good, because it shows this is one of the things that we kept getting accused of is, whose organization are you with? Who organized this? And I kept telling people, man, my organization was, I emailed 5 friends on Thursday night. My wife made these signs Friday night, the day before, on our living room floor. This is about being a grassroots community effort. There's no George Soros isn't behind this. There's no funding behind this. We're going to Dollar General and buying markers. Simple has a value in that, because it shows this is something that people and communities want to see done better, as far as how we tell these stories and whose stories we tell.
All right, Scott, thank you. On that note, thank you so much for your inspiration and your wisdom. I hope that we've gotten to a lot of people's questions. We are going to post this video on the YouTube channel of the Journal of the Civil War Era, so it will be available to people who were not able to be here. I also want to remind people, please, if you are interested in participating or getting more information, sign up using the Google Doc. I put it at the bottom of the chat. Again, you can also find it on Muster and in a variety of other places, or email us directly if you're confused. My email address is kmasur@northwestern.edu, and sign up so that we can reach out back to you. And a lot of the tips that Scott just gave, we're going to put together in a kind of written list, so you'll have them. You don't have to constantly rewind and fast forward the video again. And so we aim to provide you with as much information as we can, while also continuing to have this be kind of decentralized event where people take up this call to action in whatever ways they see as appropriate for their areas. Again, we'll be trying to connect people people in local areas to one another. The hashtag is hashtag We Want More History. We'll be tweeting about it. You can look to Muster, the journal's blog edited by Hillary Green, for more information about what's going on. And we look forward to being in touch with you, hearing your wonderful ideas and seeing what you do. Scott, thank you again so much. Thank you to Matt Isham and Cecily Zander for coordinating this. Thanks, Greg Downs. Take care, everybody.
Thank you all.